justice and migration. And yeah, you should have just had a sort of recording in progress notification. So we will be recording this session, so it's available for future people to watch. So this webinar is just an introduction. So we won't come out of this with a solution or even a complete full understanding of the topic. But I do hope that this can start a conversation and show us how important it is to consider sustainability as a justice issue. We'll cover what climate justice is and how the climate crisis is connected with migration. And there will also be a few examples of how you can support climate justice and show solidarity with migrants towards the end of the session. This is a really sensitive topic, so please do be mindful of the words and phrases that you use to describe people in the session today. And as I said, we are recording the session, but the Q&A and breakout rooms we're going to be doing won't be recorded. And please do make use of the chat function to ask any questions and share ideas throughout. The session will be interactive and we'll be using Slido as we go to sort of think about some of the topics in greater detail. And also just a quick disclaimer as well that I am not a complete expert either. I don't have lived experience as a migrant, so my knowledge on this topic is somewhat limited. And so I hope this will just be a good space for us all to learn together and think of some solutions that we can implement. So we're hosting this webinar as part of our support package for Green Impact participants, but anyone is welcome for this open access session. Green Impact is a change and engagement program run by organisations from universities, hospitals, the private sector and local authorities. And it provides a framework for teams to take positive action for sustainability within their day-to-day operations, and also align them with local priorities as well. If you're joining us as a guest today and will be interested in exploring how Green Impact could support your organisation, please do get in touch with us after the session so we can discuss a bespoke toolkit and support package for you. The webinar is also part of the European Sustainable Development Week, or ESDW, and this is a European-wide initiative to stimulate and make visible activities, projects and events that promote sustainable development and the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. And it will take place this year from the 18th of September to the 8th of October, with most events taking place this week. And I'll include a link to their website later on in case you want to attend any of their other events coming up. And so, yeah, as you can imagine, this topic that we're discussing today is linked to many of the Sustainable Development Goals. I would say it is directly connected with goals 1, 3, 10, 11, 13 and 16, but I'm sure you could make connections with this topic with all the different goals that you can see on the screen now. This might be an activity that you'd like to carry out yourself after the session today to look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and consider what actions are needed within them for climate and migrant justice. So we are going to get started with a little poll. So we're going to go to slido.com and use the code 567921, or you can scan the QR code on the screen now on your phone. And you can then rate how you're confident in this topic on a scale of 1 to 5, just to see how you're feeling. So if you can all go to slido.com, type in that code 567921, or scan the QR code on a phone. That would be great. And then we will share those poll results. And it is all anonymous, so you don't need to worry about anything like that. So I'll just get that up for you. Okay, the poll is now live. So you've got someone in the middle there saying 3 out of 5. If you can all also contribute, that would be great. Brilliant. Thanks everyone for your additions. And if you made a mistake, you can always go back and change your decision. But yeah, I can see there's a good mix of people on the call today, which is great. The average score of 2.7, so very much bang in the middle. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for contributing to that. And so what we'll do now is we'll also complete a word cloud. So I'll just pull up Slido again, and we're going to look at what words do we associate with climate justice. So what is climate justice? You should be able to see a space for you to type words to create a word cloud that we can all share. Brilliant, thanks everyone. And feel free to type anything that comes to mind. So there's no correct answers here. I'll just give you another minute for anyone still typing their words. These are really interesting ones coming out so far. It's really interesting that peace is on the screen as well, because it's actually the International Day of Peace today. So that, if whoever's put that, that's very appropriate for today's theme with the UN. Really interesting that equality is the biggest word there. So lots of people agree with that one. But yeah, these are all really, really interesting words to coming up with. So thanks so much for contributing to that word cloud. We will just move on now to go through some more definitions. So climate justice, as described by Mary Robinson, who's the former president of Ireland, its definition here is that it insists on a shift from a discourse on greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts at its heart. So very linked to what you were all typing in that word cloud, it's very much about the people, involves a very people-centered approach. So as we are in a climate and ecological crisis, and the impact of the crisis will affect communities differently, the climate justice framework allows us to see the climate crisis as a social and political issue concerned with liberation and widespread well-being. So the very communities that suffer oppression from systems that propel the climate crisis also bear the brunt of the consequences, despite more powerful groups, like the world's richest 1%, contributing more greatly to the crisis. Climate justice is a really broad concept that explores the power dynamics of how we experience the climate crisis, and also how we're able to interact with natural elements as well. It aims to ensure that our response to the climate emergency advances human rights by dismantling the root causes of social inequalities, which are also the causes of the climate crisis. So instead of sort of superficial, unsustainable responses, we're really focusing on justice. And like you were talking about sort of equality, that's sort of the bare minimum we're looking for, really. We're looking for real justice and liberation for everyone involved. And without climate justice, the climate crisis will never really go away, because the very systems that cause the climate crisis cause social injustice. So every single action that we take against the climate crisis concerns climate justice. We want to make sure that we're sort of using just solutions. You might be familiar with the concept of intersectionality, how intersecting and overlapping systems of power affect those who are most marginalized and oppressed in society. For example, we often hear about making feminism intersectional through including race, disability, sexuality, and other factors. And one way that I like to look at this concept is the image and poem Same Storm, Different Boats by Damien Barr. So you've got one of the verses on the screen there. So the effect of climate breakdown, if left unchecked, will affect everyone on this planet. The planet will become uninhabitable for humans, but many communities will feel the effects sooner and harder. And the intersections of different parts of their social identity dictate a lot of this. So the way someone experiences the climate crisis alongside the way they experience racism, for example, are not separate, but they are linked. So in other words, we're all in the same storm, the climate crisis, but our varying privileges mean that we face the storm in different boats, with some groups able to avoid the worst impacts of the crisis. And there are lots of ways of looking at this. So one example relevant to this workshop today is about sort of when you have women who are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, according to the UN. And they've estimated that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. And then within that subgroup of women, you have people who are Black, trans, or queer women are further disproportionately affected because they are more likely to be homeless, which means that they are more vulnerable to extreme weather events and less able to move. So they have a reduced mobility. That's a term that's often used. And you can also look at disability as well. So disabled people are often limited in their mobility as well. They're often less able to migrate or evacuate when needed. And then you have disabled people who are also Indigenous peoples, would also have additional elements needed to that. So they all intersect and interlink to create really unique situations. And so those systems of power are really important to understand when considering climate justice and migrant justice. And another useful example is looking at an example of injustice. So national parks are created and often seen as a really, really great example of protecting nature from industrial development. And it seems like a really great win. And is celebrated across the world. But the history of and management of parks can often be to the detriment of especially Indigenous peoples. An example is many national parks in Canada have been created on Indigenous territories, which are areas that are really important in terms of spiritual, cultural, and historic importance. And they're often created without consent of the peoples who live on that land. And those people are then forced to relocate. And so this is a really brutal example of how governing bodies can establish parks without any sort of interference or any acknowledgement of the rights of the people who are already living there. And so this is an example of a solution to the climate crisis, which actually results in the perpetuation of harmful colonial legacies, whereby the people who are living on the land are forced to relocate. And yeah, there's really unjust results from that solution. And many people also consider national borders to be an example of climate injustice, as these arbitrary lines can prevent people adapting to the climate crisis by moving to a better environment. And so there are lots of solutions to the climate crisis that we have, but they do not all guarantee human rights for all. And that's what we want to focus on with climate justice. Okay, so we've already mentioned how intersecting identities can make it more difficult for some people to move when needed due to the climate crisis, and we'll now look a bit further into this topic. So I've got a description here of what forced migration can look like from a youth activist. I'll just give you a minute to read this quote yourselves. So I thought this was a really powerful quote from Nayeli, who's a youth activist, and yeah, they've got lots of really interesting work if you want to follow them more closely. We can share these slides after the session if you would like to yeah, take any notes or read these in more detail. But yeah, I found that a really powerful quote from them. And we're now going to look, go back to Slido and look at the question, why do people migrate? I've left this quote open to interpretation, so you can think about any form of migration, not just sort of climate related, and you can also submit multiple answers. So you might want to think about positive reasons, negative reasons, anything and everything really. So I'll just pull up Slido again, and you can go to slido.com and type in that code, or you can scan the QR code there. So why do people migrate? Feel free to yeah, type multiple answers, and I'll just give you a minute to do that. Great, thanks everyone. So lots about war and safety and opportunity. So yeah, working opportunities, families are really important ones. So networks, including family. It's a really great mix. Thanks everyone for adding to that. I'll give you another minute just in case you're typing. Brilliant. Great. Yeah, these are really interesting ones. So you've got a complete range from extreme weather, hunger, disease, and you've got the education possibilities. Absolutely, that's a really, really important one. Excellent. So I think just leave that there. I know that we could probably continue talking about why people migrate for a long time, because there's lots of different reasons. And for the majority of people, there's often more than one factor when they do decide to move. It's only with forced migration that there tends to be one overarching factor that alone dictates where you're going and why you're leaving. And one thing I also just wanted to raise here is that most people are internal migrants. That means they move within their own nation, so they don't cross any international borders. There's a lot of fear-mongering about how the climate crisis will result in many people moving across the world. And while there will likely be an increase in this type of migration, most of it will be internal, so it will be within a national border. And you can imagine why this is. So if, for example, you decided to move for whatever climate-related reason, there are lots of options within your own country that might provide a better quality of life without having to learn a new language or deal with visas and other various issues. So, for example, if where I live, it's flooded and I was forced to move, I would have not choose to then move to France. I would probably move to within the UK just because that's where I'm based. So yeah, that's just an example of how a lot of the times people think about migration as a really big international issue, and it is international, but it's also a national thing. So it happens within borders as well. And I just wanted to also just touch on some definitions as well. I know we've had a lot of that in this session, but it's important to just make sure we're clear on this. So forced migration is when it can result from a range of circumstances, and it's usually the result of sudden life-threatening events such as war, floods, or famine. So you kind of touched on that in your reasons to migrate earlier. And with voluntary migration, it's a choice made by a person to move based on social or economic factors. So it could be education or work or sort of family, that sort of thing. In reality, these are often quite blurred as choices are sometimes limited. So voluntary migration might be voluntary, but if options are quite limited where the person currently lives, it can be slightly blurred as to how voluntary it really is. But yeah, that's a really big topic to go into, so we won't go too far into that today. So the relationship between climate change and migration is really complex. Climate change impacts could force people to move, but it could also trap people in dangerous places. So you have both people being forced to move and people not being able to suddenly. And floods, droughts, and rising seas could force people to flee across borders. But as I said before, people are more likely to move within their own country when they can. Some people will have no choice about how or when they move, but when disasters unfold more slowly, some people may decide to migrate and find alternative work ahead of time, basically, when they can. And some people might decide to move as a way of adapting to climate change impacts with or without the help of their government. So again, in that instance, it's a case of how voluntary is that migration when you know that you're going to have to migrate at some point. It's just a matter of when. And the rights of people who are forced to move by climate change are unclear. Many people should be protected by existing laws governing human rights. However, these are not always adhered to, and other people often fall outside the protection of existing laws and find themselves in sort of legal limbo. So there have been cases where some Pacific Islanders, for example, have tried to claim asylum in countries such as New Zealand and Australia, and they have been rejected on the basis that it doesn't meet the Refugee Convention. And I'm sure there'll be more of these sorts of cases as we go on. And it's a case of when will they be eligible for that? Because will it be when their house is completely flooded, in which case the whole island is underwater? And will they be eligible when it's, you know, less than a meter away? It's really tricky to know when this will change. And so this is another quote from an organizer about the lack of rights for people forced to move due to the climate crisis. Again, I'll just give you a minute to read this on your own. So again, I found this quite a powerful quote from Thanu talking about the lack of rights that people have. And you may have heard the term climate or environmental refugee, and this is a controversial term that can be really helpful for explaining very simply the issues around the environment and forced migration, but there is no legal precedent for this, as explained by Thanu. And yeah, this is just something that everyone knows what a refugee is, everyone knows what the environment and climate is, so it makes sense in a way to merge them together to sort of form this term. But ultimately, it'd be really difficult to prove whether someone has moved due to climate change in the majority of cases. So there are some more clear-cut ones, but the majority of them are a lot more complex. And as we've seen, there are usually multiple factors at play. So I personally don't use the term environmental or climate refugees. I prefer the term forced or displaced migration, as I think that's a bit more accurate and kind of explains it a bit clearly. But there are lots of things to consider, and I'd really recommend you do some research to find the language that you're most comfortable with when you're discussing this issue. But there are examples of more clear-cut cases, mostly around flooding and sea level rise. And the issue is that sometimes people don't want to be talked about as climate refugees, as they say it removes their agency. And we'll just look at an example of this now. So this is one that you might have seen in the news. So Kiribati is a Pacific island that has been in the news as sea level rise means it will be probably underwater within our lifetime. So within the next 50 years or so, there are predictions that it will no longer exist. And activists such as the Pacific Climate Warriors are defending rights to their homeland and culture for future generations. And in particular, the islanders would prefer the media to represent them as active change agents developing climate change response strategies, which include migration, but are not restricted to that. And this quote from former President Tong explains why they are looking at migration as a form of adaptation. And so they're trying to make voluntary migration possible through facilitating movement between nations sooner rather than later. So it's not left as an urgent case that people are being airlifted out at the last minute, but they're trying to make the transition as soon as possible. So as President Tong said, the relocation of 100,000 people of Kiribati cannot be done overnight. It requires long-term forward planning, and the sooner we act, the less stressful and less painful it will be for all concerned. And so, yeah, this term of migration with dignity, which is used by a lot of people, especially those whose whole nations or whole islands will be lost due to climate change and sea level rise. Obviously, relocation of entire island nations is a really extreme example, and most places, including in the UK and USA, are having to relocate much smaller coastal communities. So this is the extreme end of climate change and migration. I've got another quote here from a farmer based in Mexico who migrates seasonally due to the changing climate. And this is also a really common type of migration. So I wanted to highlight this for you. And again, I'll just give you a second to read it yourselves. So I found the final line of that really powerful. So when Miguel, the farmer, there's a I don't want to leave my village forever. I was raised here and here I'll stay. And that endpoint there is really common as a refrain, as a message that people do want to share. And I think it's a really good example, again, of how difficult it is to determine what is voluntary and what is forced. And the combination of factors that have led to Miguel working in the USA for a few months of the year. So you could easily argue either way that because of the climate crisis, this has caused Miguel to actually, he can't have his livelihood as he has done for the past few decades. That's why he's had to change. You could also argue that there could be other adaptation methods, so other forms of livelihood could be developed in the area. You could argue lots of different factors, and so it's a really tricky situation. So I think this is a really good example, and that seasonal nature as well is really common. So having a few months a year, so people again often think of migration as being from one place where you've always lived to another place, where you're planning to live for however many years. But actually migration is often a temporary fix, or it can be something that happens annually, but only for a few months a year. So that's why I wanted to highlight this example. And then this is a really interesting one as well. So this is from the USA. So it's really not just an issue in the global south. We also have places in the UK which will likely be threatened due to sea level rise. We're an island nation, so that makes sense. And this is an area in the USA that since 1955, the island has lost 98% of its land. And I think it has also been really badly affected by the recent hurricanes as well. The community is mainly made up of Indigenous people. And in 2016, the USA, the government there awarded the community $48 million US dollars to relocate because it was just impossible to remain there in the next coming decades. So again, you can see this quote from the tribal chief talking about how the longer we wait, the more hurricane season we have to go through. So similar in a way to Kiribati, where they're talking about planning being really important, and also not wanting to go. So that's also a really important point. So, they're saying there that we actually don't want to see the island go, but we have to. So I think that's a really good example, one to keep in mind. Again, when people talk about migration, people are often frame it in a way where people are thinking about it as an opportunistic thing, but actually people often don't want to move. It's a thing that's forced upon them when it comes to forced migration. And I also wanted to include this quote from a grandmother in Bangladesh who has seen her children and grandchildren migrate, and now she has been left behind. So again, I'll just give you a minute just to read that quote from Shamisa. So that's kind of from the other side of things, where you can see other people migrating, but she has chosen not to. And at this point, I was going to include a quiz to take you through some of the statistics around migration, but I think sometimes this can have a more negative impact, as it really dehumanizes the people who are migrating and their individual stories, which is why I've decided to put in quotes and sort of some of the examples in this presentation today. You can search for any statistics that you'd like to after the session if you'd like to further your knowledge, especially around sort of climate change and predictions around that. But ultimately, we as a species have moved around the world for millennia, and we will continue to do so. The difference is that border controls are a relatively new invention that make it even more difficult for the most marginalized to move. And migration is expected to increase over the coming decades. And so it's really important that we talk about this in a really sensitive way, as these predictions have been used by the far right to scare people and to force through quite cruel legislation that really affects the most marginalized of society. So that's why I think it's really careful. You have to be really careful around statistics and how you use them. And yeah, I'd recommend if you do want to look into that further, then by all means do so. But I'd also recommend strongly to look at the stories of individual people who've been affected by climate change and migration. So this final section will focus on how we can act in solidarity with migrants. We'll also have some time at the end for us all to consider what we can do ourselves. So we're kind of in the final section now. And to start off with, I'm just going to show a video of Maya Goodfellow. She is an expert in migration, and I'd highly recommend her book called The Hostile Environment. And in this video, she explains what she thinks needs to happen for us to support climate-driven migration. So I'm just going to play the video now, and hopefully you should be able to hear it all and everything. But as I say, I will share all the links at the end. So if for whatever reason you can't, then yeah, you should be able to watch this afterwards.
Because of climate change, people are already having to move within regions, across countries, to different countries. Their lives are being affected in immeasurable ways all around the world. Even if climate change is addressed in any meaningful way in the next few years, people are going to have to move, and they're going to have to move in significant numbers. I don't think we should be talking about this in scaremongering terms, using the language of floods or threat or mass migration. What we need to do is recognise people are going to have to move and respond to that in a compassionate and humane way. That means changing the immigration debate and changing policy in the UK. And it also means talking about the fact that people who will have to move because of climate change are not covered by existing convention, like the 1951 Refugee Convention. So trying to find ways to ensure that people are protected if they have to move, and making sure that we fundamentally change the debate in the UK so they are not talked about as a threat to this country.
So I think something that she highlighted really well in this video is that it really matters about how we talk about migration. And I think one action that we could all take from today is to ensure that we're not dehumanizing migrants in the way that we talk about people who are forced to move or who choose to move. So that's just one interesting point. And if you would like to find out more, as I say, I'd recommend her book, but also you can find more about her online. There's lots of videos and podcasts and things with Maya in them. And as I said at the beginning of this webinar, this is really just an introduction to the topic, and I strongly recommend doing some further research in the area. We do actually have a section about this on the SOS UK website, and again I'll include a link to the resources slide at the end. We've got this on there, and there are obviously more resources than just these ones on our website, but it might be a good place to start if you're just looking for more of an introduction. And I think a big thing for most of us on the call today, which we could implement in our professional lives, is to include climate justice and migrant justice in our work. And that's especially the case for anyone on the call who works with universities, colleges, or schools. And if you're a student on this call, you can always lobby your organisation to ask them to include this in the curriculum. And also you can think about the informal and subliminal curriculum. So not only what is taught, but also what's reflected in the university infrastructure, how academics travel to conferences, if they support climate emergency. There's a big call by People and Planet at the moment for universities to avoid sort of being sort of the people who are implementing any migration restrictions. So there's a really big call for that if you're interested in getting involved in that a bit further. And there are so many things that you can do to take climate action. I'm sure you're all aware, but if we can keep global heating below 1.5 degrees, this will make a really big difference to the most marginalized people in society. So we should all be doing what we can to make a difference in that. We have lots of ways to get involved on our website for both students and staff, including encouraging universities to invest in things that will benefit society instead of fossil fuels or the arms trade. We have behaviour change campaigns like our Green Impact programme, and also education campaigns and many more things coming up as well. So I'll leave you to think about what actions that you'd like to do that will be the most effective for you. I'm sure a lot of you are already doing lots, but we can always be doing a bit more. And I also wanted to highlight this example of organising for climate justice. So in 2018, 300 students gathered at the mass rally Divest, Disarm and Decolonise, which was led by student societies in Cambridge. And the rally was in response to reports that revealed over £20 million worth of investments in fossil fuel companies and over £6 million worth of investments in the arms trade by 20 colleges across Cambridge. And as I'm sure a lot of us know, the selling of weapons manufactured has contributed to violence across the Middle East, and fossil fuel companies continue to contribute to the injustices of climate change, disproportionately felt by those in the global south, as discussed earlier. And so the students marched through the streets of Cambridge and ended in Senate House, where they made their demands to the university and asked them to listen and act. And I think there's the matter of how the university reacted, but also the fact that it would raise awareness in the local area. That these quotes on the screen are just from local newspapers that reported on the issue. So there's a kind of a double-edged result from this sort of action, where you're raising awareness of the issues and sort of letting other people know how they can get involved in climate justice, as well as possibly making a really big difference in terms of investments and making those changes. And we have got a current campaign that we're working on, which is again encouraging universities to divest from fossil fuels and invest in positive companies. So if you'd like to get involved with that, please do get in touch and we can make that happen. So I thought we could end the session with a bit of a reflection on what we can do for climate and migrant justice in our own lives. So you can think about it personally or professionally, or however you'd like to. So again, just go to slido.com with that code, or you can use the QR code and scan that. And you can submit the action that you're committing to taking if you feel comfortable sharing them. Again, it's all anonymous, and I'll just read some of them out aloud because they might help inspire other people about what they do. But I totally understand if you'd rather keep the action to yourself, then feel free to just do that. And yeah, they can be personal, professional, big or small. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to think about that and to share that with us if you'd like to. Thanks everyone for sharing. I really like the ideas. So lots of people saying they're going to continue their education, go to other talks and read books, which is brilliant, as well as opening a dialogue. That's really, really important. So talking to other people, raising awareness if it's on social media or one-to-one chats, they're really, really important. So that's really great to see that people are committing to doing that. I think it's going to make a really big difference. And I saw someone talking about language, which, as I said before, is a sort of a really simple one, but something that as soon as we feel comfortable with, that can make a really big difference. So again, just making sure you're feeling educated and like you can talk about this topic with other people is really, really important. Brilliant. And yeah, in terms of professional lives, I think CPD is a really great way of doing that as well. So continue that professional development as much as you can, and making sure to incorporate this sort of topic into it is really great. Brilliant. And yeah, if you're going to organize a talk in your workplace or organize anything, then we've got some resources at the end of today. So I will make sure to share them all with you so you can, yeah, relate them to that when you're having your talk. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for sharing, everyone. I really appreciate it. And yeah, feel free to, I think sometimes making a pledge or commitment can be, if you're typing it down or writing it down, that can make it feel more real. So I hope this helps make it feel a bit more real than just sort of thinking about it ourselves. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing any actions that come as a result of this session. So we'll just go back to the presentation now. And as I say, we're just wrapping up now. So as a reminder, this webinar is part of the Green Impact programme. And as I said before, if you think you could benefit from taking part in the Green Impact programme to engage staff with sustainability, including this sort of issue, please do get in touch to discuss that or find more information on our website. And we have a chance for any questions now, and then I will also put the resources and references in the chat. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing. And then if you'd like to ask a question, you can type it in the chat or you can just unmute yourself. So we can do that. And if Rachel, we can stop recording now, that would be really helpful.